I think you're right. Recreate the spontaneity of the phone call, and people will like that.
On that note, let's just start going into things because I wanted to, we don't always have a lot of time, and I know you got a lot of responsibilities. So the topic that I wanted to talk about, because I think that we have to start more seriously understanding what our role is within the field of medicine and within pediatric sports and what implications our decisions have down the line on kids, because we don't get to see them after they're 18, 19, and 20 years old. So there's been a lot of debate in the headlines nowadays, especially after this previous NBA season is concluded, with the rate of Achilles tendon ruptures in young athletes in the NBA. So we're talking about high-level athletes that are younger than 30 years old. Conventionally speaking, an Achilles tendon rupture we think of as kind of like a weekend warrior injury where a person is well past their physical and athletic prime. If they're in the professional league at any point, we used to think that these Achilles tendon ruptures happened on the other side of 35. And certainly, we probably all have examples of people we know that have ruptured their Achilles tendon in their like 40s and stuff because they were trying to play pickup basketball on the weekends. So that was the sort of the bucket we used to think about these injuries. I think we have to change the way we approach it because this previous NBA season, perhaps it's an outlier, but this previous NBA season brought us examples of elite star athletes rupturing their Achilles tendon in the playoffs, and they're under 30 years old. And of course, the easiest examples of these are going to be Tyrese Halliburton and Jason Tatum. I'm looking through social media, I'm listening to people talk about this topic, and I'm hearing that the blame they would like to place on this is the design of the shoes that the athletes are wearing. There's a debate there between low tops and high tops. And they're also talking about the pace of the game being considerably different now than it was 20 years ago, which I think is valid. But the other thing that's been going on in the background that we've kind of been on the frontier of, but we just maybe assumed that it doesn't translate to the professional level, is that in the last 20 years, the degree of participation of children in the United States as far as youth sports goes has completely exploded. And we know that from our standpoint, the rate of participation has steadily increased, but what has outpaced this rate of participation is the degree of injuries these kids are having. So to put it more plainly, yes, more kids every year are playing more sports, but the number of injuries that kids are having is also going up, but it's going up faster than can be simply explained by there's more kids playing now. It's like there's a discrepancy between those two rates of increases. So I want to throw that out there and just pick your brain. There's not very clear evidence on this, and I don't really actually know how to design a study that actually gets into this, but what responsibility from a pediatric sports medicine perspective do we have in coaching pediatric patients, parents, coaches themselves, athletic trainers, physical therapists? What responsibility do we have to spearhead specific plans on trying to understand whether these injuries that we're seeing when kids are 9, 10, and 11 is potentially putting them at risk of developing something at a younger age when they pursue a collegiate or professional career? Is there something that we should be looking into that directly applies in that scenario?
So do you mean like just Achilles in particular? Because I wonder if this is a very publicized injury that, has a lot of downtime for athletes. But, if you would look at it in the big scheme of things, there's probably a lot of other injuries that are much more costly in terms of playing time for athletes. It just happens to be that this one comes all at once. I think we always worry about ACLs and Achilles, but I think the first answer to the question is like we need to make sure we're focusing on the right thing, right? So like spending a lot of time focusing on Achilles tendon rupture prevention 20 years down the line from athletes that we're seeing, that may not be the best place to put our efforts. But I think honestly we wouldn't know. Like I can't think of any other injury that you would say, hey, what could we be doing 10 years prior that could reduce the risk of a traumatic injury when they're a professional? I don't know. I think that's my take on it, is like if we were looking for things to work on, I think there's a whole lot of other things that I would rather put my efforts towards, like, wellness for athletes, like hip and gluteal strength, all those things that athletes don't do that affect a lot more injuries. So I don't even think we know like what the prevalence is. You mentioned a couple of NBA guys, but there's definitely a lot of good data in the NFL for a younger population sustaining these injuries. But I think in comparison to a lot of other injuries, I wonder what our focus really should be on. That would be my pushback question is why that injury and why this population?
Yeah, that perspective is reasonable. Let me make it a little bit more of a concrete example, and then maybe you can tell me what you think. So let's say that we consider an Achilles tendon rupture because of one specific event associated with sports that's non-contact. So a basketball player look to make a move, they place their leg in sort of a maximum plantar flexed position behind their body with the hope of putting the heel down and accelerating in a specific direction, and there is an acute rupture at that point. Let's say that that's the injury we're dealing with. Non-contact and MRI-proven Achilles tendon rupture. My thought of that injury is that repetitive microtrauma led to the vulnerability of the tendon at that specific point in time. And it's kind of funny, like one of the colleagues I work with, who's a spine surgeon, says, tongue in cheek, I think every person is born with a certain number of full effort, pivot, shift, jump and land random number assigned at birth. And once you've done your entire number that you were allotted, the next one you do is going to rupture your Achilles tendon. He's like, if you're genetically born with 1,000,000 of them, then you may never. But if you're genetically born with 20,000 and you want to be an NBA player, there's a certain degree of strengthening that you can do and increase that number a little bit. But if you overdo it beyond that number, you're just going to be doomed to rupture your Achilles. It's probably not that concrete, but I think the idea is that there is a certain threshold that you can increase by doing appropriate levels of strengthening and improving your biomechanics. But there's also the other knob, which is pure volume. And so if you have perfect mechanics, but you just overdo it on the volume, it doesn't matter how great your mechanics are going to be, you're still going to be at risk of some sort of rupture. So if I think about it as it's micro trauma on the Achilles tendon, we know that the purpose of that tendon is to attach the gastroc and the soleus muscles to the calcaneus bone and allow for you to be able to do the pump the gas mechanism of your ankle. If we reverse time on an elite athlete who's already in adult physiology and we take it back to when they were 8, 9, 10 years old, we know that the insertion of the Achilles tendon on the calcaneus isn't attached to the full bone, mature bone yet. It's attached to the growth plate, and you can irritate that as a child and develop what we conventionally refer to as calcaneal apophysitis or Sever's disease. My question is, what I've been doing thus far in my career when I've seen patients with growth plate irritation at the heel is say, this is happening because your calves are really tight because you're growing really fast. And if you quote unquote relatively rest and stretch your calves consistently and improve their flexibility, then the tendon will stop pulling on that growth plate so much and your pain will go away. But what I've been saying is that we don't consider this to be a serious issue. Eventually you'll completely grow out of it because that growth plate will attach to the native bone fully and it will ossify. So if you're not limping or changing your biomechanics, it's okay for you to play through a little bit of pain with this problem, as long as you're getting better with the stretching week to week, and eventually the pain should go away. And then I usually tell them, you may end up coming back to see me in a year, or you may come back to see me in 4 months and have the same problem, because if you undergo another period of rapid growth, it can become vulnerable again because you're tight, and then you'll get it again. I've been kind of brushing off the fact that they're allowed to play through pain, and I've been brushing off the fact that they may come back with recurrence. I guess what I'm trying to say is, once a kid sees us for that problem, and we're treating it this way, they do get better, but is there some cumulative microtrauma that's happening in the background that we don't have a handle on, and that we should be taking these injuries a little bit more seriously? Because maybe the body's trying to tell us, I have worse biomechanics than just tight calves, and my volume is way too much, because once I've started irritating this growth plate, I've already put myself on the pathway. And if you don't get me off this train, I'm at risk. Maybe that's what that's what the body is trying to tell
I
us.
don't know. I mean, I would say my thought would be, yes, I think the volume is the issue, but I think there's so many other factors, right? Let's say not a professional athlete, but what's your nutrition look like? What type of extracurricular, do you smoke cigarettes? Do you have diabetes? All those things would play a role. And then okay, let's say we don't know when these athletes have an injury, what's been going on in the month or two before. Maybe there was some type of antecedent injury that predisposed them that had nothing to do with all the volume that they were doing, right? So I think,
Yeah, that's true. There's
yeah,
a lot of risk
yeah,
factors there.
maybe the micro traumas is real, but also what's their tendon health, I guess, overall routine? Do they have a strategy where, hey, I do eccentrics for my calf and Achilles as far as a preventative. Like we don't know what all of these athletes are doing, and so I think I guess your point is like, but they're occurring at a younger age, and I would say the only thing that I can think of is there's a longer exposure to load in high velocity jumping plyometric type activities. I can't imagine that it's a mechanics issue that has gotten worse over time in an era where we're actually getting better with sports science. Like I just can't square up with that. I don't think it's a shoe thing. Like I think it's a volume issue, a cumulative volume issue that would be my opinion. That would be my take on it.
What? So then, do you pick up what some of these people are putting down, including former athletes that are retired from the NBA, basically saying that the nature of the game today is so much more off-ball movement than it used to be the case, and you're going kind of to like a positionless version of basketball. And now the league has kind of completely become, everybody is trying to do the same thing. And so when there's this much off-ball movement, and that doesn't seem like it's going to change. Like, I don't know from a health standpoint if you can considerably change the way the style of the game is played. But do you think that's in and of itself a risk factor that can independently explain the rates of injury?
I would say that would be a very tough statement to make because okay, let's look at college, right? I think the point would be well taken that we're not seeing, at least I'm not aware of this huge increase in tendon ruptures in college athletes. So maybe it's not, as your colleague said, like maybe it's not the number of cuts, but like the intensity, the cumulative build over time without rest. Maybe there's this thought that, hey, you get this tendon exposure, and in the other earlier days or previous versions of the NBA, there was enough time to let that tendon recover and then they would get back out there. Whereas now, like our high school kids will go uh, basketball, winter season, summer training. So like I can't, that to me is too big of a lever to ignore. And this focus on like, hey, the style of the game has changed. Sure. But I think that's a very small lever. And what are we going to do? Like talk to the head coach and say,
Yeah,
hey,
that's the problem. Like, that's
let's,
kind of like the cat's out of the bag. Like, no, we're not going
yeah,
to get the genie
yeah.
back in the bottle.
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, I mean, are you seeing it down to the pediatric, like what I would say like adolescent pediatric level? Are you seeing anything different?
It's funny that you say that. I've never in my entire career seen an Achilles tendon rupture in a pediatric patient. For the first time in my career this week, have seen my very first one. And we know, medically speaking, that when you see a young person with an Achilles tendon rupture, there's a couple of like non-sports, non-orthopedic reasons that might increase their risk. So it's very well described in the literature that if you take a very specific class of antibiotics called fluoroquinolones, of which like levofloxacin and ciprofloxacin are good examples, if you're treating some infection with these antibiotics, use of those antibiotics independently leads to some tendon pain and tendonitis. And it's regularly recommended that if you're going to prescribe that antibiotic, you coach that young person that if they do a pivoting or cutting sport, they're at increased risk of rupturing their Achilles tendon. And so this patient that I was taking care of wasn't on that antibiotic. And the other risk factor could be that they either have taken exogenous steroids or some sort of performance enhancing medicine. And that can wear away the Achilles tendon at some level and increase your risk for rupture. This patient was not taking any such steroids. And the third thing is that they've had an injection into that area with corticosteroid directly, and that's also not the case. So this is a person with no risk factors that I came in, landed, felt a pop, couldn't walk properly. We know that we conventionally do what we call the Thompson test to check for how high our concern should be that a person has ruptured their Achilles. And the way that we do that test, we squeeze the calf muscle while the person's lying down on their stomach. And if we squeeze the calf muscle and we see the ankle pump, then we know that the Achilles tendon is working properly. And if we squeeze the calf muscle and we don't see that reactionary pump, that means we should be worried about a rupture. We had the most classic positive Thompson test where that affected ankle was not pumping like it's supposed to when I squeezed the calf. That was the first time I've ever seen a test that positive in a teenager. And I got the MRI, and it's an MRI proven full thickness rupture of the Achilles tendon with a retracted segment. And so that's the first time I've ever seen it. I looked at the literature, and there is some case reports reported, and I think I see a case series of like 40 teenagers or something collected over several years that had it as well. And so I think it does happen, even though it's only the first time I've seen it. But it's really on my mind now because the NBA season ended not too long ago, And now I'm seeing a teenager with the same problem. And so maybe I'm getting a little bit biased because I'm seeing a lot of it pop up in my life. And that's why I was inclined to talk about it. But that I think that's why maybe I feel more compelled that we should perhaps restructure the way we consider how we're dealing with Achilles pain or ankle pain in the younger population. Because maybe there is some influence that that has if a person we're taking care of wants to pursue a collegiate career or professional career beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I've never seen it. So I will say, like, that's one more I've seen. You know, I think the tough part is every time we come up with some advice for a patient, we always have to be like, is the patient willing to do that? Is the family willing to do that? Right. So, like, giving advice that nobody's willing to do is worthless, in my opinion.
That's a good
And
point.
so, like,
That's a good point.
I would say, like, telling
That's a good
someone
point.
that they need to modify in the face of having no pain would be very, like, unlikely to occur.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, to your point, right, to say, like, what if we suggested that athletes do more of this tendon training, like tendon health training, whether that be a eccentric loading protocol for their Achilles, for their patella tendon, just as far as like a maintenance, I guess you could say, like, hey, like, you know, your Achilles maintenance or your tendon maintenance, I guess, would be what I would say might be what somebody would be willing to do. But I don't think it's a stretching issue. So I don't know if that's what Kevin Garnett is saying, but I don't think it's a stretching issue. I don't think it's a shoe issue. Sure,
Yeah,
there may be
we should
something
pull up
there.
we should pull up that video at some point and watch it. But I watched a little clip of it, and it was basically Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce saying that the current NBA class of elite athletes is not doing enough calf raises. Now, I'm not on the strength and conditioning team of any NBA professional team, so I wouldn't know the degree of whether or not they're doing enough weighted calf raises or not. It seems kind of odd to me. These are star players. Like the examples I gave
Yeah,
were like
yeah,
the
yeah.
star players. So,
Right.
and to my knowledge, I think Jason Tatum was somewhat like an Iron Man in terms of time lost before this injury happened. So I don't really look at him and think this guy clearly isn't training properly. And again, that's purely anecdotal, of course. I don't know what he's doing, but
Yeah.
it seems like we're barking up the wrong tree if we say that they're not doing enough strength training in the right format. Like that
Yeah, I
seems
mean
like it's not.
that's easy for someone who's like is not there. Like how would he know what calf raises, you know, they're doing? Like they don't report their workout session to Kevin Garnett. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah, yeah,
I think that's a talking head type of statement to catch
yeah.
people's. But I mean, you could make the argument that like doing slow and controlled eccentric calf work has some scientific basis, but you know, that's the best that I could come up with if I was advising someone that was like, "Hey, I'm worried about this." You know, that's basically what I would probably recommend.
So as we would describe, the eccentric loading phase of any exercise is where the muscle or tendon is getting longer while you're trying to control a weight or a force. So if we're talking about the ankle and the Achilles tendon and the calf, we would say that when you push your toes down and stand on your toes, that's the concentric phase. And then the eccentric would be coming down in a controlled fashion until your heel is back on the ground. That's
Or
the
if it's
eccentric
off the
phase.
edge. Yeah, or if it's off the edge and you can go a little bit lower than, you know, your starting
Yes.
point.
So if you're standing on like a step and
Yeah.
you go up on your toes, then the eccentric phase would be the coming down till it's neutral. And then because you're on the edge, your heel can even drop below your toes and you can get a real deep stretch through the
Yeah.
Achilles tendon and through the calf. So that would, you're saying like that protocol, which, you know, certainly a lot of evidence for that. Lots of papers published about how if you have Achilles tendonitis, that's like that specific type of loading seems to be the thing that improves pain and function and improves your rate of return to sport adequately. So it's good science based there, but you're not talking about it from an injury rehab standpoint. You're talking about it like make this a part of everything you do as like a prevention rather than like treating after the fact.
Yeah, I think so. If we're saying like exposure is leading to this increased rate of, I would say maybe what we do is we have to intervene with care, tendon care, because the exposures are longer and more intense, and that's what's leading to this earlier shift in the you know, the injuries. But I mean, like tendons love load. They like load. They like to be loaded. And I think that gives a stimulus for good health. And so I can't see why that wouldn't be a reasonable start. Again, I don't have any data to present, but I would say I can't see why that wouldn't be a reasonable start that somebody would actually do.
Yeah, I guess I'm
That's my
just in my
point.
head when I'm thinking about the NBA level. I guess I just assume they're all on the cutting edge and that they'd already be doing something like this. And that
Mm-mm.
I guess my thought is they've optimized what any one athlete in an NBA team could or would do, and they're getting the ruptures anyway. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe like if we talk to an athletic trainer of an NBA team one by one, they might say we might be surprised with how little emphasis they're actually putting on that.
Well, it might not be little. It just might be not be like a protocol, like how you would say, hey, sit down, hey, do your tendon health maintenance. And that is, I guess what you're saying is like you would assume that that's incorporated into these workouts if someone's like solely focusing on these athletes. But I guess, yeah, I don't
You know
know.
what? At the edge, it's interesting. At the edges of elite performance, to speak to your point, I think there might be something at play there. I'm going to use a different example. So the paradigm in golf, kind of similar to the NBA, is that within the last 10 to 15 years, the game has changed such that as much distance from the tee on your drive as you can get is preferred. And it almost, with some caveats, doesn't matter how accurate that shot is. So the idea of always hitting the fairway off the tee are not necessarily always important anymore, as long as you can just minimize the distance from wherever your first shot goes to the pin. So if you're on a par 4 and you drive off the tee and you get the ball in the fairway and it's still 250 yards from the pin, that's worse, even though your lie is better, than hitting it into the rough but only being 200 yards from the pin. So that's different than how we used to think about golf years ago. So the incentive for golfers now is to work on their swing mechanics from the drive to optimize the club speed and the ball speed. And it matters somewhat what direction the ball ends up going, but you tolerate a lot more mishit because you're just trying to minimize the distance from your first shot to the hole. So to speak to that point, nowadays the swing mechanics are far more exaggerated because you're really trying to increase the club speed as fast as you can. And we know that as you stand in front of the ball when you're trying to drive, you want a good base, you want good core strength, you want good glute strength, you want a good energy transfer from the ground up to the club, and then you want to like kind of generate that potential energy like a spring and then release it and let the ball go as far as it can. And you want to lose as little biomechanically as possible during that process. One, so that the swing is efficient, and two, so you prevent injury. So that's obvious. But at the edges of elite performance, what my brother has been telling me as he's been finishing up his weight training regimens this last summer is I used to just worry about core strength, and that is 90% of the answer. And I've been really improving my core strength, my glute activation, and that's helped me increase my ball speed. But I didn't realize that I actually have to individually exercise and train my forearm muscles, which is something I've neglected until now. Because if you're an amateur golfer and you want to go from 150 ball speed to 160, just doing regular strength training and getting stronger is adequate for that. But if you're at the edges of elite competition and you're trying to go from 172 ball speed to 178, you've already probably maximized what your glute strength is going to be, or there's going to be diminishing returns on that. But if you haven't worked your forearms, even though that's a small muscle group, that makes quite a big difference. However, if you started with forearms when you're an amateur, you're not going to get much bang for your buck at that point. So there's it's kind of like a pyramid where as an amateur you want to build a good base, but at the edges of elite competition, there's not much separating everybody. And so forearm strength might be the difference between shooting 3 under or shooting par. And so to that effect, maybe there's something at the elite edges. You kind of see this, that if you just get everybody a good foundation, you just kind of assume it might be good enough. And so maybe there is some neglect of calf strengthening the way that you're describing it, because we just think that that's good enough. And we kind of think through squats, they'll just kind of naturally build enough calf strength. But maybe to your point, there needs to be that, oh, you've already done all that, but there's actually more homework to do because you're an elite athlete. You're not just like an amateur.
Well, I think to go back to the original question of what can we do on the pediatric side to potentially stem this slow creep younger and younger, I think that's a lever you can pull that's easy. It can be incorporated into, I mean, if we're talking specifically about the Achilles, it could be incorporated into a home workout routine. I mean, you can do it while you're waiting for the bus to pick you up in the morning. You know what I mean? There's ways that we can incorporate that pretty easily. So I would say that would be fit into our original question of Like, what could we advise these kids with severs and other ankle injuries if they're like, well, do you guys know if this is related to the injury? No, we don't know, but here's something you can do. One, that will help you with your current issue, but two, that may be beneficial for long-term health of the tendons. I think we do know loading tendons is good. So I'm not even saying it has to be a strength, like heavy dumbbells, kettlebells type of
Yeah.
issue. I'm just saying, like, put it under load for a certain amount of time and, see what we get.
Yeah, you're not asking for like progressive overload. You're not looking for the muscle to get bigger per se. You're just looking for the tendon to be able to withstand greater load. How are we measuring this over time to make sure we're making positive gains?
I don't think you really know, because it's not a neuromuscular function where it's like, oh, well, they'll get better coordinated, they'll get better. I mean, I guess you
Yeah.
could determine it by uh weight, but again, right, like, this is what I want to get at for like just general advice you're giving kids, right? Like, giving somebody advice that has to do with like progressive overload with weights that they don't have access to, that's probably not the ideal thing. But giving someone some mindset of like, all right, well, I just want to put tension through my calf, and maybe it's number, right? Maybe that's what it is. It's like, how many can you do till failure? I don't know that gets at the same endpoint, but that might be a proxy. But I think that is better than nothing. If you're
Yeah.
looking for an answer, that's what I would say.
It's interesting because if you don't have pain and you start doing eccentric calf protocols, and I guess conceivably, like if you train it enough, it's hard in the beginning because you're untrained, and then it gets
Yeah,
easier.
yeah.
Then that's a way of saying like, okay, like that's something that like that's positively adaptive. I couldn't do this
Yeah.
well before. I can do it much better now. But the idea is like if they didn't have pain to begin with and they don't get pain during the protocol, you haven't quote unquote fixed a problem. And then I just don't know what the end goal would be in terms of like, maybe there isn't an end goal. Like if your prescription was 3 sets of 20 eccentric load, holding 20% of their body weight in one hand or whatever, I'm just making something up, and they're not able to do it, and they train and train, and 3 months later they're able to do exactly your prescription. Is that enough for that player? And you just say like, okay, now stay, like don't lose the gains, just do this regularly to stay here.
I mean,
And have
I
we done our
think that's
job?
fine. Yeah. I mean, I I would say there would probably need to be a research study to say like
Yeah, fair enough.
how do we apply that? But a lot of what we do is like, I don't know, I guess this is a little bit of a digression. Like, I listen to these other podcasts and stuff, and it's like sometimes the connotation is, hey, physicians, like, they don't really know and whatever. And it's like, yeah, we don't know everything, but at some point, the research can only show you so much. Like, what people are willing to do in real life makes a bigger difference than like what they should be doing. So, telling everybody when you see them, like, hey, you should lose some weight, like, okay, like, sure, like, that's great advice. But if no one's going to do it, then that's a waste of your time. And I think giving people advice like, hey, after practice, let's do some slow, go up and then 2, 3 seconds down, like for tendon maintenance. Like, I don't see how that would be harmful if someone's asking me, right? Like, if no one really cares, then fine, but I don't see how that's harmful to say, that's your medicine, that's your
You're preventative.
yeah, that's your preventative treatment, that's your walk in the morning, that's your whatever people do for preventative treatment of whatever issue they're having. It's like um ACL injury prevention, right? Like, we don't say like, well, when do we know when to stop? You don't. You just keep doing it.
That's true. You're talking about like the FIFA 11 stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's a good point. I guess I'm looking for something like that for Achilles tendons. If I was trying to like bookmark how I wanted this conversation to go, is basically like, what do we do to get to that point? Because we know, like particularly in girls more than boys, they have an increased risk of rupturing their ACL rather in pivoting and cutting sports from a non-contact injury. We know that like if you're playing a contact sport and you plant your leg and someone dives at your knee and takes out your knee and you tear your ACL, there's no level of like back squats that was going to prevent that. A 130-pound person just rolled over your leg. There's nothing you can do about that. What we hope to do though is that we'd like to improve the mechanics of how people jump and land and change direction, so that in the situations where someone plants their leg and wants to go a different route than they're currently going, that planting mechanism doesn't put too much force through their ACL and then ruptures it. So that's what we call the non-contact rupture. And we know
I like
that
where you're going with
boys.
this. I like where you're going with this, right? Like, you're setting me up, but I like where you're going with this.
So the question is, like, we know that through our biomechanical evaluations, landing mechanics in girls more than boys, but in both genders, landing mechanics matter. And you can measure how poorly somebody lands and recognize the risk factors that might be there that increases their chances of rupturing their ACL in a game. You can prescribe them specific exercises that's supposed to decrease the poor mechanics of landing. And then you can retest it 2 months later and see if they're better. And you can take a video before and after and show the athlete, you used to do this poorly. We think that this increases your rate of ACL rupture. You've done the right thing by doing this rehab. I've just measured you again and did this video, and it looks better now. You can see that it looks better. And we think that this means you're going to have a decreased risk of non-contact ACL rupture. Whether or not, I think that that's true. I think there's enough evidence to suggest that going through that process does fundamentally decrease at the individual level the rate of non-contact ACL rupture. Such a thing doesn't exist in the Achilles, and I think that that's because we conventionally think that the ACL, the way that the knee is arranged, can consistently find itself in an awkward position when you jump and land or when you change direction. We don't really think of the ankle that way, and the Achilles is a tendon, it's not a ligament. And so I think for good reason, we don't have such a protocol understood biomechanically for the Achilles. And that might be to the point that because it's a tendon and it's more of a volume thing, like you said.
Yes.
But I would love to have some, I think that was probably the point that you were going to go to.
No, I think it makes sense to say, like, okay, well, I would love to see, like, if there's anybody listening that's like, hey, there's these biomechanical risk factors for Achilles tendon, I would love to hear those. But I think, right, like, I'd wonder that it doesn't exist that we know of because that's not the risk factor, right? It's not, maybe, like, it's not like how you run, like what pressure, is put on your medial foot when you rotate. Like, maybe it's hard to measure that, but, and like you said, I didn't even think about this. Like, we're talking about a tendon more so here.
Yeah.
And so
because
maybe
if you do an ankle pump, like I am voluntarily moving my Achilles tendon.
Yes. Yeah.
It doesn't matter what I do. Like, unless have you lying down on the table and you do a Lockman on me, you can't move my ACL.
Right, you don't
and I can't move it
activate the
either.
ACL. Yes.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's a good point. And that's where I'm getting at, that tendon maintenance might be our best lever to pull from a pediatric
The analog
standpoint.
in the ankle might be lateral ankle sprains. I know they're not as devastating as an ACL tear, but they're ligaments. The lateral ankle compartment is ligamentous. And we know that poor flexibility of the ankle, poor motion of the ankle, and poor proprioception, or knowing where the ankle is in time and space, those are independent risk factors of increasing your risk of injuring those ligaments by spraining your ankle. And then the rehab is to improve the mechanics of how the ankle is used so that it doesn't happen again. But that's not, I don't really think of ankle sprains as a volume thing. I think of them as a mechanical thing and purely.
Well, that gets at the point of ligament versus tendon, right? Like, the ligaments are stabilizing structures, right? Whereas the tendon, the Achilles tendon, is not a stabilizing structure. I mean, obviously it creates some stability, but that's not its intended purpose, right? So, you wouldn't make the argument that loading your ankle or loading your knee would help strengthen your ACL, and that we know of. We don't think that poor mechanics cause an issue with maybe Achilles. I mean, I guess you could make the argument, all right, poor mechanics can cause Achilles tendonitis, which can set you up for these micro injuries, so to speak, that can then go on. So I think if you circle back and say, okay, well, maybe poor mechanics isn't the cause of the issue, but it can lead to the 2 steps before. Maybe working on mechanics is another option, but it's hard to tell somebody to work on mechanics for something that might happen in 10 years.
Here's another question on mechanics. Another thing I've seen consistently discussed is that when these athletes that of more recent memory have ruptured their Achilles, if you watch the video, the leg that's about to be injured is behind them, and they put the foot and ankle in a position of like loaded maximal plantar flexion. And if you look closely, like you can even see the rupture happen in real time. So the idea is like, can you change the way that athletes move? And I think I have my answer to this, but can you change the way that athletes move such that if you put even like a micro bend in the knee in that position, it might take enough slack off the Achilles tendon that rupture doesn't happen? And so the idea is like, instead of having a extended knee with the heel down where that Achilles is, because we know like the gastroc muscle, which attaches to the Achilles, spans the posterior aspect of the knee. So when your knee is bent, you're not putting your gastroc muscle under maximum lengthening. But when your knee is straight, you can. And so when the knee is straight, the soleus, the gastroc, and the Achilles, all three are as maximally lengthened as possible. And that's an eccentric load. And that's where it seems to be that this rupture happens. So the conversation is like, can we prevent athletes from getting into that position? And I guess it's a good question to ask, but I don't know what to do with that because these
Yes,
are
it's
elite
impractical.
athletes. Yeah, these are elite athletes that are going to react the way
Yeah.
their adrenaline system is functioning. They're not thinking, I don't know how to hard code it in them to make it intuitive to not be in that position. How many times have they done that in their life?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
allowed them to get around a defender, and
Yeah.
they've finished and they've won games with that play. And we're sitting in a situation now where we're wondering whether we should unlearn that, which I don't think is practical because how are we going to do that to begin with?
Yeah, I think the good example I would have with that is, how we'll have these issues that maybe have to do with like running mechanics. Let's, a little bit esoteric, but like an exercise associated compartment syndrome where your leg gets a little bit under too much pressure from certain mechanics that may be caused when you're running, and people think, okay, well, let's try to just modify their gait, right? Like, but sure, that might work for somebody who's a cross country runner or jogs on a treadmill, but it's futile to tell someone who's playing soccer, hey, we're going to adjust your running mechanics so that this injury or pain doesn't occur. I think that's really impractical. But I mean, I guess we're getting at there's only so much you can do. Like the volume of sports is only going up, right? The change in the way the game is played, it's not
We have
it's
no
not
control
going
over
going
that.
yeah, it's not going back to that, right? So like there's all these things where you're like, all right, well, can we make a recommendation here or there? It's like the only things we really have control over is what someone's going to do in the gym. And I don't think that someone's going to adjust the way they cut or pivot. Like I think that's very impractical. So that's why I've kind of come back around to like, all right, well, like tendon maintenance, because I think you could make the same argument for patella tendon, not just in a function of patella tendon rupture, but
Yeah.
patella tendinopathy, right? That causes a lot of missed playing time, but it's not something that's flashy that's going to show up on Twitter that such and such a player has tendonitis. Like that's not
Yeah.
as the views for
I
that
always
are
love
going
it
to
when the medical teams just put on there like knee inflammation. And I'm always
yeah,
like, oh my
right.
God,
That could be
who
anything, but
knows what that means?
but so like that may be occurring a lot more than we know, and we should be advising, overall tendon protocols. I mean, you can make the same thing for baseball too, shoulder and elbow,
I'm
but
so glad you just brought up baseball because I was just about to put a bow on this by quoting another colleague who says the overhead baseball pitch is just like the most maladaptive thing you can ask your upper extremity to do. Like finding your shoulder and elbow in that maximally externally rotated and maximal valgus position and then accelerating it as fast as you can towards a target is just not something that humans were designed to do. And my question is like at the rate of elite basketball, I guess I buy that, right? Like I mean, certainly humans aren't designed to do something like that. Like that's not what we were born to do. It's great that the most elite among us can develop that and then make an MLB career out of it, but it's certainly not something that the vast majority of humans were designed to do. On some level, is that also true with how basketball is changing? Is an 82 game season, again, we have no control over that. That's completely money dependent. And who knows if the owners of all of the teams would ever agree to shortening the season in any really tangible way. Is an 82 game season with a long playoff series afterwards and a relatively truncated offseason, is that realistic in terms of expecting even the ones that are the elite athlete? Like, are we just asking our most elite humans to do something that is not really human?
I think it's not the actual physical motions that they have to do. I'm going to go back to it's summer ball, it's longer basketball season, it's people having to travel, high school kids having to travel to different states and back-to-back games. And like, I think it's if somebody really wants to solve this problem, I would propose the maintenance program as well as like looking at, dark periods for that sport and trying to come at it from a totally different perspective than a biomechanical one, to the point you made that like if we assume that these elite trainers, these elite teams have every resource available to them to prevent what happened to Halliburton, then we can make the argument that maybe that's not where the answer lies. And the answer lies in something else that is not being controlled. And that may be the volume of activity that athlete's doing. I think that is like the stamp I would put on the end of this conversation. That would be my point.
I think what we should touch on at a later time is, as far as youth sports goes, because you alluded to this, the idea of the travel teams playing on multiple teams, multiple sports year round. I think what will be useful for us to discuss is we should talk about how that actually might be maladaptive and detrimental to performance. So we don't even have to talk about injury prevention because, of course, that we know that that's true. But if we're sitting in front of a 7-year-old and their parents are asking us, I want to optimize the chance that this 7-year-old is going to have the ability to play at an elite level when they're in college. Intuitively speaking, you might think, okay, well, we got to start now. We got to start laying down the foundations now. I think we should be addressing in one of these talks in the future how the exact opposite of that, at least early on, is paradoxically more helpful for their performance as a late teenager and early adult than trying to sport specialize right away.
Yeah, sounds good to me.